I'm Sella, I'm 28, and I never imagined a Monday morning could turn into a scene that would replay in my mind for weeks. I work at a mid-sized marketing firm here in Chicago, just like thousands of young professionals chasing stability and growth. But that morning, an intern, someone I barely knew, decided my entire sense of dignity wasn't worth sparing. Before I could even sip my coffee, she hurled it across the room, splattering my blouse, my notes, and my brand new laptop sleeve. Then she leaned in, her smirk sharp, her words sharper. "You shouldn't mess with me. The CEO is my husband." I froze, coffee dripping onto my arm, a stinging reminder of the sudden betrayal. The room went silent, but the air felt heavy with something more: fear, anticipation, and disbelief. I looked at her, trying to understand why a 22-year-old intern thought she could speak like that in front of everyone. My mind raced. Who does she think she is? And why does anyone believe this nonsense? Before I could respond, I caught glimpses of my coworkers' faces. Some stared in shock, eyebrows raised, mouths slightly open. Others avoided eye contact, as if the situation wasn't theirs to deal with. The HR manager hovered by the doorway, unsure whether to intervene, flipping through her clipboard as though paper could somehow fix human audacity. I realized immediately that the hierarchy of fear was in full display. The intern, confident in her supposed connection to the CEO, had disrupted the entire balance of authority in one small act. My heart raced as I dabbed at the wet fabric on my sleeve. The coffee wasn't scalding, but the sting felt symbolic, almost personal. In that instant, I felt more than irritation. I felt the weight of humiliation that comes when someone weaponizes lies against you in a public space. And yet, I couldn't let myself scream. Not here, not now. That's when the first ripple of strategy formed in my mind. I need to handle this carefully. I can't let anger or embarrassment dictate my next move. The intern's eyes sparkled with triumph. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence was louder than any threat. I noticed the subtle shifts in posture among the staff, people leaning away, murmuring under their breaths, avoiding confrontation. It was as though her coffee attack had instantly rewritten the unspoken rules of the office. Audacity equaled power, and connections, even imaginary ones, were enough to make colleagues hesitate. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the internal storm. Don't react emotionally. Observe. Document. Plan. But it wasn't easy. I felt a mix of fury, disbelief, and a creeping doubt about whether anyone would believe me if I reported this. The intern, confident and smug, had already claimed the CEO's authority. And in that moment, it struck me that she might not just be lying, she might be manipulating, testing, seeing how far her fabricated power could extend. As I surveyed the room, I realized the visual damage of the coffee spill mirrored the emotional damage. My laptop sleeve was soaked, my notes smudged. The smell of brewed coffee mixed with fear and tension. I could hear the faint drip of liquid pooling on the floor. Every sense heightened, as if the office itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Zella," HR's voice finally cut through the tension, tentative and uncertain. "Are you okay?" I glanced down at my soaked sleeve and muttered, "I'm fine." But my voice lacked conviction. I wasn't fine. I felt violated, not physically, though that stinging coffee reminded me I wasn't entirely unharmed, but psychologically, emotionally, and professionally. This young intern had not only invaded my personal space, but had asserted dominance in a way that made everyone around us hesitate to act. The intern chuckled softly, leaning casually against a nearby desk, as if she owned the place. "Maybe you should remember who's in charge," she said, her tone sharp and mocking. Her smugness was infuriating. And yet, I reminded myself that I couldn't escalate this in front of witnesses. Not yet. Observing her arrogance, I realized her behavior wasn't just a personal attack. It was a test of my boundaries, my patience, and my ability to navigate a situation where logic and authority were temporarily suspended by a lie. I noticed subtle gestures around the room. The receptionist glancing nervously at her computer screen, the junior designer shifting uncomfortably in her chair, even our senior account manager leaning back, silently evaluating the scene. The office dynamics had subtly shifted in mere seconds. A small coffee spill, a bold claim, and suddenly the internal ecosystem of the office had realigned. I tried to recall any moment where the intern had interacted with the CEO. Nothing. I thought of the staff emails, casual meetings, and shared projects. No hints of a personal relationship existed. My mind pieced together a puzzle. The audacity of her claim, the way it paralyzed everyone, and the opportunity it presented. This was chaos, but chaos can be used. Observation is power. As I dabbed at my blouse again, careful not to spill more coffee on my laptop, I became acutely aware of my pulse and breathing. My hand trembled slightly, not from physical pain, but from the rush of adrenaline and disbelief. My senses felt sharper. The soft hum of the office air conditioning, the rustle of papers, even the faint scent of spilled coffee wafting around me. It was cinematic in its intensity, almost surreal, yet painfully real. Honestly, I muttered under my breath, leaning slightly to the side to avoid the spreading coffee. "What is wrong with you?" Her response was a mocking tilt of the head. "You'll see," she said cryptically, as if the threat of her claimed connection to the CEO was enough to intimidate anyone who might dare to challenge her. In that moment, I realized the coffee spill wasn't just an accident or a prank. It was a calculated move. She had chosen a time and place where she could maximize humiliation, using proximity and shock to assert dominance. Every subtle movement, every glimmer in her, told me she had rehearsed this internally, perhaps imagining the impact it would have on me and everyone else. I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of resentment and rising determination. I wasn't going to let a reckless intern define my worth or my day. I looked around again, taking in the silent witnesses. Each person had a choice: intervene, watch, or stay neutral. And while many stayed still, I knew that my next move needed to shift the balance, not with anger, but with clarity and strategy. I started to gather my ruined papers, placing them carefully to avoid further damage. Every motion was deliberate, controlled, signaling that I was not broken or defeated. I could feel the intern watching, calculating, expecting a meltdown. But I remained calm, inwardly repeating my mantra: observe, document, plan. The HR manager finally stepped closer, hesitant. I can arrange a meeting," she said, her voice uncertain, maybe with the intern and someone else. I nodded slightly, realizing that while she was trying to help, HR's caution mirrored the fear rippling through the office. No one wanted to confront the claim directly. It was easier to maintain a polite distance. But I knew I couldn't let this rest. The intern's words were dangerous, and the psychological damage, both mine and the office's, needed addressing carefully. For the next few minutes, I sat quietly, feeling the dampness of coffee against my skin, the smell lingering in the air, and the weight of attention from everyone around me. The moment had become a tableau of tension, audacity, and silent observation. Then, almost imperceptibly, I noticed the subtle cracks in her performance. The confident tilt of her chin faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of doubt passed through her eyes. She hadn't anticipated my silence, my composure, and in that microsecond, I understood something crucial. While she had staged this moment, the real power would lie in how I responded. I whispered under my breath, careful not to let anyone hear, "You think this is control. But control is earned, not claimed. The coffee spill had shattered my calm, yes, but it had also illuminated the stakes, the personalities, and the unspoken tensions in the office. I had entered that morning expecting a routine start to my week. Instead, I found myself in a high-stakes psychological standoff, testing my patience, my judgment, and my ability to act decisively without reacting impulsively. I looked around once more, inhaling deeply. Every dripping drop, every shocked glance, every trembling hand in mine was part of a larger story unfolding. And even though I didn't yet know how it would end, one thing was clear. The morning coffee spill wasn't just an accident. It was the spark for a chain of events that would demand courage, strategy, and resolve I hadn't fully tapped before. For now, all I could do was sit, compose myself, and let the tension simmer, watching, listening, and planning. The intern had thrown coffee, yes, but in doing so, she had underestimated the calm beneath my shock. And just as the smell of coffee lingered in the air, so too did the first seeds of my quiet determination. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The lingering smell of coffee and the stinging memory of the spill didn't fade as I moved through the office that morning. Instead, they seemed to settle around me, sticky and oppressive, like the weight of every unspoken rule in the room. I returned to my desk slowly, aware that every step, every rustle of paper was being watched. The intern had unleashed more than a mess on my clothes. She'd introduced uncertainty into every corner of our office. Every glance now carried suspicion. Every silence felt amplified. I noticed how people's expressions shifted when they thought I wasn't looking. Karen from accounting, usually chatty and warm, now hunched over her spreadsheet, eyes darting toward the intern, and then quickly away. Mike, the IT guy, pretended to fix a printer jam, but his gaze flicked repeatedly toward me, as if he were trying to measure the damage, and maybe wondering whether I'd crack. It was subtle, but perceptible. I'd spent enough mornings observing office dynamics to recognize fear when I saw it, and I realized something crucial. The intern wasn't just brazen, she was succeeding at making people second-guess everything. I had to know just how deep this web of influence went. I started paying attention to the hushed conversations in the break room. At first, it was nothing. Small murmurs, snippets of phrases about deadlines and client accounts. But slowly, I began to hear her name. Not directly addressed to me, but in circles, almost like a ripple spreading out from some hidden center. I wouldn't cross her. One voice said, "Didn't you hear? She's married to the CEO." Another chimed in, skeptical, but hesitant. I think that's what she said. The words felt like soft, poisonous arrows, barely audible, yet lodged firmly in the walls of the office. It became clear that people weren't gossiping to be mean, they were anxious. They didn't know if the claim was true, and the uncertainty paralyzed them. Fear had taken a subtle but powerful form, and I could see it reflected in posture, in tentative gestures, in avoidance of eye contact. My first instinct was irritation, almost indignation. I wanted to shout, "None of this is true." But I restrained myself. I needed to understand the extent of the perception before acting. At lunch, I wandered to the small kitchenette, pretending to heat my leftover soup, but I was listening. The intern was already there, chatting with Jessica from client services. Her voice carried confidence, though not loud. She didn't need to shout. Her presence commanded attention. "Well, I just spoke to him yesterday," she said casually. "He's very busy, of course, but he asked me to check on certain things personally." Jessica nodded, seemingly impressed. I clenched my spoon, trying not to let my frustration show. She was weaving a narrative, and people were swallowing it. Curiosity mixed with strategy. I realized I needed evidence, subtle observations, something that would help me expose the falsehood without looking petty or overreacting. I began noticing patterns in her behavior. Whenever someone questioned her, she tilted her chin, slightly smiled, and redirected the conversation. It wasn't loud or confrontational. It was almost imperceptible, but effective. The confidence she displayed was learned, almost practiced, I had to admit. There was a kind of skill in it, but skill built on lies is dangerous. Over the next few days, I observed interactions that would have been easy to dismiss if I wasn't paying attention. The intern would pause slightly when answering questions from management, glancing subtly toward a coworker as if gauging reactions. She would casually drop phrases like, "I'll get his input on that," leaving others to fill in the blanks. People assumed she meant the CEO. A single phrase, delivered with confidence, created a ripple of assumed authority that I could see spreading across departments. I started quietly checking emails and project logs, not to snoop maliciously, but to cross-reference what she claimed. Every time she mentioned consulting the CEO, there was a gap, not a small one, a full week where no communication existed. Nothing in official records or messages supported her statements. My heart raced as I realized that the office's collective nervousness was entirely unwarranted. Fear had been manufactured, not by a real threat, but by perception and deception. At one point, I cornered a colleague during a lull in meetings. "Did you actually see her talk to him?" I asked softly. My tone was casual, non-accusatory, but pointed enough to encourage honesty. The response confirmed my suspicions. "No, not really. But, well, everyone just, she seems connected, you know." The hesitation, the stammering, it was all I needed to know. The intern's power existed entirely in imagination and misdirection. I also noticed subtle acts of compliance. When she walked past a coworker's desk, heads would lift, conversations would pause. People made small concessions in their tasks, offering space or help that wasn't needed simply to avoid confrontation or, in their minds, to curry favor with a powerful figure. It was a small, silent surrender of agency, and it happened everywhere she moved. The psychological effect on me was not insignificant. Even knowing it was false, part of me felt the familiar weight of doubt. Could she be telling the truth? Am I missing something? It's strange how even the most rational mind can waver when enough people around you hesitate to challenge, hesitate to act. That was the intern's real weapon, sowing seeds of doubt so subtly no one noticed they were being manipulated. I began documenting everything, every statement she made, every interaction I observed, every subtle ripple of office behavior caused by her. I kept a notebook discreetly tucked into my bag, recording times, dates, and specific phrases. It was tedious, but it helped me stay grounded, provided a factual backbone against a cloud of rumor and suspicion. Each entry strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was protecting the office from a small but dangerous culture of fear. Meanwhile, I noticed the strain it placed on others. Emma from marketing, usually jovial, now avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers. Tom from finance seemed perpetually distracted, fumbling with numbers he usually had mastered. Fear, even if unacknowledged, had consequences. Mistakes, miscommunication, tension. The intern's lies weren't harmless. They were eroding the office from within, quietly but steadily. At one point, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. The intern had cornered a junior employee, her voice sweet but insistent. "You know, you don't want to make waves." He wouldn't be happy if he heard about that, right? The junior employee nodded nervously, agreeing to something they hadn't been asked to do yet. My stomach tightened. Here it wasn't just perception, it was coercion, subtle and psychological, made plausible by the invented connection she claimed. I realized then that exposing her would require precision. A simple accusation wouldn't work. People had already started questioning their own judgment. I had to reveal not only the falsehood, but also the subtle manipulations she had wrought, all without triggering defensiveness or panic. It was delicate, like defusing a bomb made of nerves and assumptions. The intern, of course, didn't notice my quiet surveillance. She carried on with casual arrogance, joking in a meeting about consulting her husband for approvals, making offhand comments that left some managers uncertain whether to challenge her or nod politely. Every lie became a small trap, ensnaring colleagues in fear and uncertainty. As I continued observing, I noticed that she was not reckless. She had limits. She avoided certain people who asked too many questions, quickly backtracking if someone looked doubtful. This was key. She had confidence in the room, but it was contingent on control over perception, not substance. I realized that if I could expose this web of perception, I could unravel her power without confrontation, slowly and methodically. At the end of one particularly tense afternoon, I returned to my desk and reflected on the psychological environment she had created. My coworkers weren't malicious. They were cautious, conditioned by the intern's bravado. It struck me how easily fear and manipulation could creep into ordinary workplaces. A single bold lie, repeated with confidence, could ripple through an entire office, creating stress, doubt, and subtle compliance. I decided to take another approach, empathy combined with observation. I wanted to understand her motivations. She wasn't malicious in the classic sense. She was ambitious, nervous, and desperate for recognition. Her lies were her shield, and perhaps her only method of navigating a world she perceived as hostile. Understanding this gave me a clearer path forward. My goal wasn't humiliation, it was clarity and justice. That evening, I spent time reviewing all my notes and observations. Patterns emerged. She avoided accountability, thrived on rumor, and exploited the office's reluctance to question authority. Every subtle shift in posture, every whispered confirmation of her claims had been calculated, whether consciously or instinctively. I knew then that to restore balance, I needed evidence, patience, and a strategy that left no doubt. As I left the office that day, the memory of the coffee spill mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of lingering fear. I walked to my car, thinking about the fragile balance between truth and perception. In her absence, the office seemed quieter, the tension less palpable. But I knew the intern's influence lingered, hidden behind whispered suspicions and hesitant glances. I resolved that night that I wouldn't let this manipulation continue. I would restore transparency, not with anger, but with facts, careful observation, and calm action. The stakes were clear. Her lies had already begun to reshape behavior, erode confidence, and test loyalty. My task was to untangle the threads without shattering trust or creating further disruption. I returned home exhausted, my mind still buzzing with observations, whispers, and subtle cues. I realized something important. Secrets and suspicions don't exist in isolation. They feed on the fear of doubt, the hesitation to question, and the invisible desire to avoid conflict. And the longer this went unchecked, the more fragile the office's equilibrium became. I drifted to sleep that night, notes by my bedside, a quiet determination setting in. Tomorrow, I would continue observing, recording, and preparing. I knew one thing for certain. In a room full of hushed conversations and careful glances, the truth was the only weapon capable of restoring balance. The night after observing the subtle manipulations and hushed whispers throughout the office, I lay awake in my small Chicago apartment, the city lights flickering against the blinds. I couldn't stop replaying every detail, the intern's confident smirk, her casual references to her husband, the ripple of unease that traveled through every coworker she passed. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept reaching for my notebook on the nightstand, thinking of the notes I needed to take, the small details I might have missed. By the next morning, My resolve had crystallized. I needed evidence. Hard, irrefutable evidence. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because a lie this bold, this disruptive, couldn't be allowed to influence an entire office. The intern had already changed the rhythm of our workplace, and every whisper, every sidelong glance, was a reminder that unchecked deception was dangerous. I started my day like any other, but everything I did was intentional. Every interaction with the intern, every glance at a coworker, every casual comment I overheard became a data point. I didn't confront her, not yet, but I watched, listened, and mentally recorded. Her confidence relied entirely on people assuming her story was true. If I could quietly gather proof that contradicted her claims, I could remove the illusion she depended on. At my desk, I pulled up the company's internal emails, project management logs, and client approval chains. Everything was documented, time-stamped, and trackable. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I cross-referenced her claims with real records. Every time she said, "He said I could do this," or "I got approval from him personally," there was a gap. No email, no memo, no calendar note. It was meticulous work, but the pattern became clear quickly. Her confidence was a performance built entirely on lies. I also began informal conversations with colleagues, casually probing their awareness without revealing my intent. "Hey, did you see the CEO comment on the client deck?" I asked in a light tone to Emma in marketing. She hesitated, brows furrowed. No, I didn't. Why?" I shrugged, pretending not to think much of it. The moment was brief, but her hesitation told me she hadn't actually seen any correspondence from the CEO related to the intern's claims. One small conversation, a tiny thread unraveling. I kept a private log of these interactions, recording dates, times, and snippets of dialogue. I even began noting subtle gestures, eye contact, body language, changes in tone. It was like creating a behavioral map. I noticed how the intern avoided direct questions when anyone asked for specifics, and how she carefully redirected conversations. These small evasions were consistent, almost mechanical. She had rehearsed her lines so well that only careful observation could detect cracks in her story. Midweek, I noticed another layer of her influence: indirect compliance. Several coworkers had begun adjusting their own tasks to accommodate her supposed authority. Karen from accounting, who was usually precise and punctual, started sending reports faster than necessary, often copying the intern in an extra email chain. Mike from IT subtly prioritized her tickets without her explicitly requesting it. These weren't massive decisions, but they were signs that perception of power had real effects. I documented these quietly, my notebook filling page by page. I also took small precautions. My own work needed to remain flawless and documented to prevent anyone from twisting events to make me seem overreactive or unreasonable. I labeled my emails carefully, copied supervisors when appropriate, and maintained a calm, professional demeanor. I noticed the intern occasionally watching me, perhaps sensing that I wasn't buying into her narrative. My silence, my meticulous behavior, made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't realize. One morning, during a brief lull in the office, I spotted her glancing toward a manager's office. She walked over, smiling, as though she were delivering an update. I lingered nearby, pretending to focus on a spreadsheet, but I observed her body language. Shoulders relaxed, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning. She exuded confidence, but it was precise and calculated, no slip of genuine authority. I realized that if I could catch even one direct claim she made to management in the context of her supposed connection to the CEO, I could begin building an airtight case. That afternoon, I encountered another subtle but revealing moment. I was returning from a meeting when I noticed the intern speaking with Tom from finance, low-voiced, animated. She gestured with her hands while he nodded, occasionally glancing over his shoulder toward the office. I slowed my pace and listened. Her words were careful, selective, mentioning approvals she had never actually received. Tom seemed hesitant, agreeing only half-heartedly, but she didn't hesitate to continue. I felt a mix of vindication and concern. People were being influenced by her half-truths, and I needed a way to document this without causing alarm. By midweek, I had also begun observing patterns outside direct interactions. The intern's network was imaginary, but her influence extended indirectly. Emails referencing approvals, offhand comments in team meetings, and casual drops about the CEO's input. All were carefully constructed to create a sense of authority. I started to record every instance, creating a spreadsheet with timestamps, claimed authority, actual documentation, and witness notes. It became a quiet obsession, but one rooted in purpose. The truth was fragile, and if I acted too late, the web she had spun would become impossible to untangle. Late that week, I observed an unexpected twist. One of the junior designers, a quiet, meticulous person named Allison, confided in me almost in passing. I think she's lying," Allison whispered. I asked her about the CEO's approval, and she couldn't show me anything. Her voice was low, hesitant, but her words were gold. A subtle alliance formed, a shared understanding that the intern's claims weren't backed by reality. Allison agreed to help me note interactions discreetly. Together, we began forming a fuller picture. I also began using indirect questioning as a strategy. "Oh, did he actually mention that in the email?" I would ask when the intern mentioned approvals. The intern's smiles would falter slightly, evasive, shifting topics smoothly, but each redirection gave me more evidence of inconsistency. My notes grew heavier, filled with small moments that would later build a compelling record of deception. The more I observed, the more I noticed how the intern relied on perception rather than proof. She thrived in moments of ambiguity, in the silences, in people's uncertainty. She had learned that a confident claim could outweigh reality in the minds of coworkers who didn't have complete information. Every subtle nod from others reinforced her authority, making her feel untouchable. My strategy became clear. I couldn't confront her publicly yet. I had to collect evidence that exposed her web, leaving no room for doubt. A minor incident midweek further reinforced my plan. During a client call, she casually mentioned getting the CEO's direct input on a proposal. I kept my voice calm and neutral, asking, "Oh, did he email you or leave a note?" Her pause, the tiniest flicker of uncertainty, made my heart race. That hesitation, fleeting as it was, confirmed everything I suspected. Her authority was performative, fragile, and based entirely on assumption. I recorded the moment, every second, knowing it would become a critical point in my evidence. I also began considering the office hierarchy. Some managers were hesitant to confront her, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of being wrong. My quiet documentation would need to overcome this fear, to provide clarity. I couldn't rely solely on observation. I had to connect facts, timestamps, and witness accounts in a way that left no ambiguity. Each note, each recorded inconsistency, became a building block in a larger narrative. The intern, oblivious to my growing record, continued performing her confident persona. She occasionally leaned on charm, making small jokes about her connection to the CEO, casually referencing approvals, and inserting herself into projects she didn't belong to. I noticed subtle cracks, slight hesitation when asked specifics, a delayed response when cornered by factual questions. These were gold. By the end of the week, I had developed a quiet routine. Observe, record, cross-reference, repeat. My notebook was thick with details, my mind alert to every nuance. I had created a precise map of her lies, her methods, and the influence she wielded over my colleagues. The strategy wasn't reactive, it was proactive. Every recorded moment would later allow me to dismantle her claims carefully, exposing deception without confrontation and restoring balance to the office ecosystem. As I shut down my laptop that Friday evening, the hum of the office still lingering in my mind, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and empowerment. I had transformed my frustration and disbelief into a methodical plan. The intern had thrown coffee, created fear, and disrupted harmony, but now, armed with observation, documentation, and patience, I was ready, not with rage, not with anger, but with evidence and strategy that could quietly restore truth to the office. I left the office that evening, clutching my notebook, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt before. The intern's web of influence was intricate, subtle, and powerful, but so was the truth I had been quietly assembling. In this game, patience, attention, and careful strategy would win over arrogance, lies, and theatrics. I walked out of the office into the crisp Chicago air, my mind already replaying interactions, analyzing gestures, and noting every inconsistency I had observed. For the first time since that Monday morning coffee spill, I felt in control. The intern might have confidence, but confidence built on deception is fragile. And with every recorded interaction, every carefully noted lie, I was preparing to show the office and the CEO the truth in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. I left the office that Friday evening with my notebook clutched tightly in my hand, a sense of purpose coursing through me. Every observation, every recorded misstatement, every subtle gesture had led me here. I knew what had to be done, though the thought of actually calling the CEO made my stomach twist in a mix of fear and anticipation. I wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but the intern's audacity, her carefully constructed empire of fear, demanded action. The weekend passed slowly, each hour stretching with the weight of anticipation. I reviewed my notes obsessively, ensuring I had concrete examples, timestamps, and documented interactions that would expose her lies without ambiguity. Each page was a small victory in my mind, proof that strategy and patience were stronger than impulsive anger. I also rehearsed the conversation over and over, imagining her reactions, imagining the CEO's response. Every detail mattered. Monday arrived, and with it, the usual hum of fluorescent lights, keyboard clicks, and low office chatter. But this morning, the atmosphere felt different to me. I walked in, calm, collected, while subtly observing the intern. She moved through the office as though nothing had changed, smiling at colleagues, joking about approvals and deadlines. Her confidence was palpable, but I noticed small fissures, micro expressions of doubt when she glanced in my direction, subtle hesitation when referencing her supposed authority. By mid-morning, I knew the moment had arrived. I stepped into a quiet corner near the reception area, taking out my phone. My fingers hovered over the dial pad as I rehearsed my opening line silently. My heart thumped, a steady drum of anticipation. I reminded myself, calm, neutral tone, precise words. This was not about anger or humiliation. It was about clarity and exposing the truth. I dialed the number and put the phone to my ear, listening to the faint ringing as each second stretched. The sound of the ring echoed in my mind, reminding me of the coffee spill, the whispered lies, the subtle panic she had instilled across the office. I thought about how far this intern had gone to manipulate perception, and it fueled my determination. I would not falter. Hello. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. I recognized it immediately. The CEO's voice, measured, slightly amused. Hi, this is Zella Monroe. I began, my voice steady but soft, carrying a confidence I had known I possessed a few days ago. I work in marketing, and I need to clarify something regarding an intern in the office. It's urgent. There was a brief pause, and I imagined him raising an eyebrow, curious. "Go on," he said, his tone neutral, neither alarmed nor dismissive. I took a deep breath and continued carefully, choosing every word deliberately. "There's an intern who has been claiming a personal relationship with you, and it's affecting the office. I wanted to ensure you were aware, and perhaps you could come to the office briefly to address this directly." The CEO chuckled softly, a low, amused sound that somehow made the tension in my chest increase rather than decrease. "And in turn," he repeated, "claiming what exactly?" I kept my tone calm, avoiding any hint of triumph. "She's claiming that you are her husband," I said simply, letting the words land. It's created a lot of confusion and hesitation among staff, and I thought it would be best if you could meet her in person to clarify directly. There was a longer pause this time. I could hear him thinking, his voice carrying a trace of disbelief and curiosity. "I see. That's certainly unusual. I can come by this afternoon. Should I bring anyone else?" "No," I said quickly, careful to sound professional and unassuming. "I think your presence alone will clarify everything. The office. Everyone would benefit from a clear answer." We arranged the timing, and I hung up, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline surged. The plan was set. I knew that when he arrived, the intern's confidence would be tested like never before. But I also knew that the moment had to be orchestrated carefully. Any misstep could allow her to deflect or manipulate further. Back at my desk, I maintained a calm exterior, typing emails, reviewing campaign schedules, pretending that nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But inside, I was alert, scanning the room for her movements, noting the reactions of colleagues who had already begun whispering about the call. There was an electric tension in the air, subtle but pervasive, as if the entire office sensed that a pivotal moment was approaching. The intern moved through the office with her usual casual confidence, checking emails, chatting with colleagues, making jokes about approvals and deadlines. I watched her closely, noting the slight hesitation in her movements whenever she glanced at me. Her micro-expressions told a story she hadn't realized she was revealing. Uncertainty, worry, a flicker of panic beneath the practiced smirk. As the CEO arrived, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. His presence was commanding, quiet but undeniable. Conversations faltered, keyboards paused, chairs creaked as heads turned. I stood slightly aside, notebook in hand, pretending to review reports, but fully aware of the stage that was about to unfold. The intern noticed him immediately, and the confident, smug tilt of her chin faltered for the first time. I watched as she approached, voice carefully measured, trying to maintain control. "Hi, you must be busy," she said with a practiced smile, though her eyes betrayed her tension. The CEO raised an eyebrow, looking at her calmly, not amused, not angry, just assessing. "I've heard some interesting things this morning," he said slowly. "Care to explain them?" Her smile faltered, subtle but perceptible. She opened her mouth, paused, and then tried to redirect with an offhand comment about a project. But the CEO's gaze didn't waver. He didn't allow her to hide behind excuses or charm. The room seemed to shrink, every observer caught in a suspended moment where truth and falsehood collided. I remained quiet, standing to the side, observing carefully. Every gesture, every hesitation, every blink became critical. I noticed the slight shift in the intern's posture, shoulders tensing, hands clasping together, lips pressing into a thin line. She was no longer the confident, untouchable figure she had portrayed. The reality of being confronted with the truth, with someone who could instantly verify her lies, was beginning to dawn. The CEO's voice was calm but firm. "I've never met you outside of official meetings, and certainly no personal relationship exists." His words were clear, neutral, factual. No exaggeration, no mockery, just the unassailable truth. The intern's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a stammer that revealed the panic bubbling beneath her surface confidence. She attempted a laugh, a weak deflection, but it rang hollow, betraying the control she had relied on for days. The room held its breath. Colleagues exchanged glances, whispering in disbelief at the revelation that had just landed. I felt a rush of quiet satisfaction, not from malice, but from justice finally asserting itself. The tension that had gripped the office for days began to dissipate as the truth settled into the space, displacing fear and uncertainty. People exhaled almost collectively, realizing that the narrative of authority had been fabricated, and that the reality of honesty and integrity was restoring balance. The intern tried one last attempt at regaining control, but every gesture, every word, was met with calm scrutiny. The CEO's presence alone dismantled her constructed power, leaving her exposed and uncertain. I observed her shoulders slump slightly, the first true sign of defeat. She had relied entirely on perception, and perception could not withstand direct confrontation with reality. I stayed silent, notebook in hand, recording the nuances, the stammered words, the shifting posture, the fleeting flicker of panic. Every moment was a testament to the fragile nature of lies built on confidence and assumption. And in that quiet observation, I realized the deeper lesson. Power constructed on deceit will always crumble when faced with clarity. The CEO addressed the office briefly, reiterating protocols, clarifying that false claims about personal relationships could not influence decision-making, and thanking everyone for their professionalism. The words were simple, clear, and firm, yet the impact was profound. Silence, previously heavy with tension, now carried relief, understanding, and a renewed sense of equilibrium. I noticed small shifts in my colleagues' behavior. Emma smiled subtly at me, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. Tom relaxed at his desk, returning to work with more focus. Karen's posture softened, and conversations returned to their usual rhythm. The subtle tremors of fear had dissipated, replaced by renewed confidence in honesty and accountability. The intern lingered awkwardly for a moment, glancing at me as if searching for a reaction. I offered none, just a calm, measured presence, letting the truth itself complete the confrontation. She realized, finally, that the foundation she had relied on, fear, uncertainty, and perception, was gone. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet, humbling awareness that actions have consequences, and lies are fragile. By the time the CEO left, the office had returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations flowed more freely, chairs scraped without hesitation, and keyboards clicked with renewed energy. Yet, the impact of the phone call remained. The invisible threads of manipulation had been severed, and the lesson was clear. Integrity, preparation, and calm decisiveness could restore balance in ways that anger or confrontation could not. I returned to my desk, notebook still in hand, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not pride, not malice, but relief and empowerment. The office had regained clarity, and the intern had learned, painfully, that confidence alone is not authority. The ripple effects of honesty and courage were subtle, but undeniable, restoring trust and equilibrium. After the CEO left, and the office slowly returned to its hum of activity, a strange stillness settled over the room. It wasn't the tense, nervous silence from the week prior. This was different, calmer, heavier with understanding, and filled with a quiet sense of relief. I sat at my desk, hands folded over my notebook, watching as my coworkers resumed work. Some laughed softly at small jokes. Others moved with a new ease, no longer constrained by fear or uncertainty. The intern, meanwhile, remained at her desk, head bowed, typing mechanically, glancing up occasionally with a flicker of unease in her eyes. The audacious confidence she had carried like armor for days had vanished, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. I didn't gloat or confront her. I had learned over the past week that triumph lies in quiet resolution, in truth spoken and observed rather than screamed. My satisfaction was subtle but profound. The weight of integrity had replaced the chaos she had created. I took a deep breath and let my mind wander, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. It struck me how powerful perception is in shaping reality. For days, the intern had manipulated others not through action or authority, but through suggestion, insinuation, and the careful exploitation of fear. And yet, when confronted with facts, clear, undeniable, methodically documented facts, even her confident facade crumbled instantly. Truth had a quiet, unstoppable power, and witnessing it in action was both humbling and inspiring. I glanced at my notebook, filled with pages of observations, timestamps, and quotes. Each entry was more than just evidence. It was a chronicle of subtle courage, the patience to observe, and the strategy to act deliberately. I realized that the act of recording, reflecting, and preparing had been as empowering as the CEO's confirmation itself. It reminded me that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, and persistent, and yet it can have far-reaching consequences. Over the next few hours, the office atmosphere shifted further. Small moments of reconciliation occurred naturally. Emma, who had been unusually quiet all week, approached me with a gentle smile. "Thanks for, handling everything," she said softly, her eyes reflecting relief. "I didn't know what to think until today." I nodded, keeping my tone light. "It's okay. I just wanted clarity. That's all." Her gratitude wasn't overblown. It was genuine, reflective of the subtle stress the intern had imposed on everyone. Even Tom from finance, who had seemed hesitant and distracted for days, returned to his usual workflow. I noticed his posture relaxed, the tension in his shoulders easing. Karen from accounting laughed more freely, leaning over to share a small joke with the receptionist. The ripples of relief spread naturally, like sunlight through a previously overcast sky. The office had returned to normal, but not exactly the same normal. It had been tempered by clarity, by an unspoken recognition that honesty and diligence could override fear and manipulation. The intern, however, seemed trapped in her own thoughts. I observed her quietly, noticing how every small interaction carried hesitation. She avoided speaking to management unnecessarily and no longer made offhand references to approvals or personal connections. The confidence she had wielded like a shield was gone, replaced by a careful, almost defensive demeanor. It was fascinating to witness. The transformation was subtle, yet unmistakable. At one point, she approached me cautiously, a faint tremor in her hands. "Zella, I just wanted to say," she began, her voice hesitant, almost apologetic. I didn't interrupt, letting her continue. She paused, unsure how to phrase her words, then muttered, "I didn't mean to disrupt things." There was no excuse, no deflection, just the bare acknowledgement of her actions. I nodded slightly, offering a calm smile. "Thank you," I said softly. "That's all that matters." Her relief was palpable, though tinged with embarrassment. I realized then that the lessons of this week weren't solely about exposing lies, they were about accountability. The intern hadn't intended to harm maliciously, but her actions had consequences. And she was beginning to understand that confidence built on deception could never replace integrity. It was a lesson she would carry with her, quietly without fanfare, and that realization felt like closure. As the day continued, I noticed another subtle transformation. The office itself seemed lighter. Conversations were more open, collaboration more natural. People smiled without hesitation. Decisions were made with renewed confidence, not influenced by fear or uncertainty. The truth had restored balance, but it had also restored trust. Trust in each other, trust in the process, and trust in the principle that honesty matters. I took a moment to reflect on my own journey. The coffee spill had been the spark, but the real challenge had been internal, navigating emotions, patience, and strategy. I had felt anger, disbelief, fear, and frustration. I had questioned whether I could remain composed. And yet, through observation, careful documentation, and calm action, I had navigated the situation without losing my integrity. I realized that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. Later that afternoon, I walked past the CEO's office and noticed him giving a casual nod toward the team. There was no grand acknowledgement, no dramatic announcement, just quiet recognition. A subtle confirmation that the truth had been established and that the office was functioning as intended. I smiled internally, appreciating the understated power of his presence and his approach. Sometimes the simplest actions carry the deepest lessons. Even the intern began to regain composure gradually. She didn't resume her prior behavior, but there was a subtle shift, a willingness to follow proper channels, to consult supervisors, and to respect boundaries. Her initial arrogance had been replaced by a cautious awareness. I noticed her occasionally seeking guidance, no longer asserting imagined authority. It was a quiet but meaningful transformation, proof that even mistakes can become opportunities for growth. I spent the evening reflecting further on the week's events. The office had been a microcosm of larger truths. Perception can be powerful, fear can spread quickly, and manipulation can appear insurmountable. Yet, facts, patience, and integrity are more enduring than any fabricated confidence. I thought about the subtle courage it took to act, not impulsively, not confrontationally, but deliberately, methodically, and with clarity. It was a reminder that power is not always about action. Sometimes it's about observation, preparation, and timing. I also thought about the human side of the intern's behavior. She hadn't been cruel in the classic sense. She had been ambitious, misguided, and fearful of failure. Her lies were a shield, not a sword. Recognizing this allowed me to feel empathy without excusing her actions. It reminded me that everyone has moments of weakness and that lessons are often learned through discomfort, confrontation, and accountability. In the following days, the office settled into a new rhythm. I continued observing subtly, but the tension that had defined the previous week had evaporated. Interactions were smoother, collaboration more natural. Even small conflicts that arose were handled with clarity, not assumption. The balance had been restored, and it felt resilient this time, rooted in facts, honesty, and a quiet awareness of the consequences of deception. I also noticed subtle changes in my own perspective. I had gained confidence not through confrontation or aggression, but through meticulous planning and thoughtful action. I had learned to trust my instincts, to observe carefully, and to act decisively when the moment demanded it. The experience had strengthened my sense of self, my understanding of human behavior, and my ability to navigate complex social dynamics with integrity. By the end of the week, I realized that the true power of the phone call and the quiet strategy leading up to it was not simply exposing the intern. It was restoring equilibrium, teaching accountability, and demonstrating that truth, when combined with patience and strategy, can overcome fear, deception, and manipulation. The office was quieter, but more confident. Colleagues were freer, interactions more authentic. And I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, rooted in justice, clarity, and personal growth. As I shut down my computer on Friday evening, the city lights flickering through the blinds, I reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a simple coffee spill. That moment of disruption had sparked fear, tension, and uncertainty, but through observation, documentation, strategy, and ultimately courage, the chaos had transformed into clarity. The office had learned the value of truth, and I had learned the value of patience, precision, and subtle action. The intern, now quiet and thoughtful, had also learned her lesson. Confidence is fleeting when divorced from truth. Authority is meaningless without integrity, and lies, no matter how boldly delivered, will crumble when faced with observation and facts. The office had witnessed this quietly, and its effects would linger far longer than the memory of the coffee spill. I took a final glance around the now calm office. Laughter returned, keyboards clicked, and conversations flowed freely. The lessons of fear, manipulation, and the fragility of lies had been internalized. The silence that had once been heavy with tension was now filled with understanding, reflection, and quiet empowerment. And I knew, as I packed my bag and walked toward the exit, that the most enduring victories are those built on patience, observation, and the unwavering power of truth. As I stepped out of the office that evening, the city lights reflecting softly on the sidewalks, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The past week, the chaos sparked by a single careless coffee spill had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. What began as humiliation, confusion, and subtle fear had transformed into clarity, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose. I realized that the moments that challenge us the most often become the ones that shape us if we are patient, attentive, and willing to act with integrity. The intern's bold lies had shaken the office, but they had also created an opportunity for everyone, including myself, to recognize the delicate balance between perception and reality, between fear and courage. I thought of the colleagues who had hesitated, worried about making mistakes, or feared crossing her. Now, I could see their posture, their expressions, even their voices, freed from tension. The subtle smiles, the quiet jokes, the small conversations that had once felt stifled, they were all returning. The office was alive again, vibrant, yet tempered by the knowledge that truth matters more than bravado, that honesty and patience can restore what manipulation temporarily unsettles. And as for me, I understood something profound about power and confidence. True authority doesn't come from fear, false claims, or imagined influence. It comes from consistency, integrity, and the courage to act thoughtfully, even when it's uncomfortable. I had discovered that one doesn't need to raise a voice or confront with fury to make an impact. One only needs to observe carefully, prepare deliberately, and act decisively. That quiet, careful strategy had dismantled a web of deceit without chaos, without drama, and without unnecessary conflict. It had reminded me that courage is rarely loud. It's quiet, methodical, and deeply grounded in principle. Looking back at the intern, I felt neither triumph nor malice. Her lessons had been harsh but necessary. Confidence without honesty crumbles, and lies, no matter how cleverly performed, are fragile against scrutiny and truth. I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor, the carefulness, the humility, the awareness of consequences. I hoped she would carry that understanding forward, not as shame, but as insight. And I hoped that my colleagues, who had watched everything unfold, would internalize the power of observation, patience, and the quiet strength of doing what is right. Walking home, I felt an unfamiliar calm, a sense of control that had nothing to do with authority or dominance, and everything to do with clarity, preparation, and self-respect. I had faced manipulation, fear, and uncertainty, and I had navigated them with patience, strategy, and integrity. That week would remain with me always, not as a memory of humiliation or betrayal, but as a lesson in resilience, courage, and the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. In a world full of assumptions, whispers, and unseen influence. I had learned that observation, honesty, and thoughtful action are the tools that truly restore balance, and that the power of truth, when wielded with care, can change everything